child custody disputes sometimes have jurisdictional issues. And when we're talking about celebrities, actors and actresses, those issues come up usually more than your average case. With us today is going to be Brooke Mulligan again, who's going to talk about a very famous couple. Who are they, Brooke?
Jonas and Sophie Turner.
Stay tuned. Well, Brooke, it's time for let's go to Hollywood again and see what kind of divorces are happening around the area here.
Yes, I'm very excited. So today we're just going to be talking about Joe Jonas and Sophie Turner, but there's a lot to talk about.
Joe Jonas and Sophie Turner. Two
Yes.
people I've never heard of. So can you kind of set that up? I know a lot of our viewers know. I don't know. I got to have some foundation here.
Okay, so Joe Jonas was a child star. He has a band with his brothers called the Jonas Brothers, very original.
Mm-hmm.
They started when they were younger, took a hiatus, and now they're back. He also had another band called, I realize I've never said it out loud. Is it Dance or is it D? Okay, it's Dance, but they spell it DNCE. So,
Okay.
They took some liberties with the word.
I've heard the Jonas Brothers.
Yes.
I don't know their music really, but I've heard of them.
So
yes.
he's the middle brother and lead singer.
Okay.
And then Sophie Turner is most known for acting in Game of Thrones. She was Sansa Stark, the Queen of the North. People really like her. She did a great job. So she has a lot of goodwill. They both kind of have a lot of goodwill, actually, or did, which we will get into. I think this case is really interesting because it touches on something that I don't think we've talked about, which are, what you do when there are two different international locations that the parents want the children to live in.
Ooh.
So it's a good one.
Okay, can we stop right there?
Of
So
course.
California, is it a California divorce?
It is, well, this is a little complicated. He originally filed in Florida. She then petitioned in New York and used the Hague Convention to basically stop, and she wants there to be a ruling that the children's habitual residence is in England. And I'm going to get further into that, but the countries we're dealing with are the United States.
Okay. I think what we should make clear is he files for divorce in Florida. She actually says the divorce should be in England. In order to make that argument in America, she files under the Hague Convention in New York.
In New York.
It's probably a federal court, I'm going to guess.
Well, and something that's interesting, and I'm going to get further into it, is she does not think Florida is the correct venue, period, because they didn't live there long enough. So, like in California, if you want to file for divorce, there are residency requirements. You need to have lived in California for 6 months and in the county for 3 months. And I believe Florida is very similar in that respect.
Okay, not to get too wonky, but under the Uniform Child Custody Jurisdiction Enforcement Act, we call it UGIA, there is a reciprocal agreement among almost all states, except for the great state of, I think it's Maine, who decided to be the outlier. But they've all agreed that home state means 6 months where the child has lived or where the child was born if the child isn't up to 6 years of age.
Correct.
Okay. So she's saying that didn't happen in Florida. It's wrong. She's attacking Florida on a jurisdictional issue.
Correct.
Okay.
So let's start with some background. They were married in 2019 twice. The legal marriage was in Vegas, and then a month later they got married in France with a big, beautiful wedding. I wasn't able to find the date of separation, but I believe it's somewhere between August 15th, 2023 and September 1st, 2023. So not a huge difference, and I don't think the date of separation is going to be hugely impactful here.
What's the length of the marriage then, approximately?
Like 4 years.
Okay.
There are two children, both daughters, one born in July 2020 and one born in July 2022. There's also a prenup. And so if any of our viewers have watched our episode on the Kevin Costner divorce, we talked about it in there as well, but a reminder that you cannot contract custody or child support in a prenup, which is why, even if you have a prenup, you may be going to court if there are children. So going into a timeline, because this has been played out in the media massively. It felt like you couldn't go, a couple days without seeing something. And it really started strong and fast. Rumors started swirling that there were issues late August, very early September. She posted for his birthday on Instagram on August 15th, and he posted a picture with his ring on September 2nd. And that September 2nd date is kind of important because it turns out he filed on September 1st. And the September 2nd posting came after a lot of rumblings in the media that he had been seen without his ring. So it's just very interesting timing. But we don't know that he's filed until September 5th.
I want to say something. You talked about that suddenly there's some media attention or some things that are posted. I never thought about this, but I wonder if any of these super high-profile people get spin doctors to get out there and start spinning their stories like this, because it seems like they start that right away.
That's
always in all these cases.
All these cases, and it felt especially strong in this case. And something I was going to talk about was it does not seem like it worked out for Jonas, who appears to have been the one talking to the media more so than Sophie. There's been a lot of backlash. So, like I said, it comes out that he filed on September 5th. And almost immediately, there are sources speaking to TMZ implying that Sophie is partying. That's the reason for the divorce. Joe has had to, take care of the kids while she's in England filming. And it's not, completely hurtful towards Sophie, but there are definitely a lot of implications, and the backlash is pretty swift. People go back and find old interviews. For example, in early COVID shutdown, they did an interview where, she talks about how the shutdown's been okay for her because she's, a real introvert. She finally has Joe home. She helps him when he's, DJing online. She brings him shots when he asks. It's very different from what we're hearing now. And, when you get the internet on your bad side, they are going back and finding anything to make you look not so great.
Yeah, you got about 7 billion people that have access to the internet, so they're going to find every little nook and cranny, right?
Yeah, and it seemed, if Joe and Sophie were kind of at the same level of goodwill within, the social media, as silly as that sounds, his goodwill plummeted pretty quickly from what I have gleaned, and I am trying not to be biased, but I definitely got on the Sophie bandwagon a bit as well. But after September 5th, on September 6th, they release a joint statement, very amicable, very standard. We ask for our privacy. We're, with love, separating, everything they say. Interestingly, pretty soon after that joint statement, Joe is seen out with the daughters, which may not seem like anything, but they, as parents, have made a big deal about keeping their daughters' privacy, not showing their faces, not posting about them. We didn't even know the youngest daughter's name until maybe 2 days ago. So many people saw this as
posturing.
That's a great word for it.
Yeah.
And so
we see that a lot in cases, or at least the allegation, I should say, is there's one parent who's been the primary custodian, while the parties are married and living together, right? And suddenly the divorce starts, or even if they're not married, the custody starts, and suddenly the other parent, a lot of times it's the father's accused of this, it suddenly becomes, the father of the year, right?
Right.
It's cooking them breakfast and walking them in the morning to their school, and putting them to bed and reading to them, and going to the doctor's appointments. And if you go just, a couple months in the other direction, backwards, it's like none of those things happen.
Right. And of course we want that to happen, but it's easy to become a little cynical about it.
Well, how useful is a couple of months of putting on a show? I mean, the guy's an actor, right? He could act like a good father for a while, right?
Right, yeah.
So, go ahead.
That's a good way to put it. And so, again, there's some backlash towards Joe. People, like you said, see this as posturing. And then on September 9th, Joe says during his concert in California, "I just want to say, look, if you don't hear it from these lips, don't believe it, okay? Thank you, everyone, for your love and support. Me and my family love you guys." And again, he's met with backlash because people feel like he's the one who has been putting these little, tidbits in the media, and then he wants to come out at his concert and, kind of play innocent.
Oh, wait, I want my privacy, but I'm going to talk about it selectively, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
And then there's some silence. We then hear rumors that the final straw that made Joe file was that he had video footage from a Ring camera, and she did something on that. They don't say what it is, they're letting people's minds kind of go wild. But she never responds to this. We found out a few days ago that apparently she had said something bad about him on the Ring
Probably
camera.
on the phone with her mother or sister or something like that.
Something.
It's kind of interesting is you're talking, I'm sorry to keep interrupting like this, but I saw a documentary on the Johnny Depp thing that he had, with, what was her name,
Amber Heard.
Amber Heard. And really what I took away was how much the social media public weighed in on that case real time.
Definitely.
And then continued afterwards. And, there was just a snowball avalanche against the woman, and stuff. And it seems like, and because Johnny Depp was an actor, you could see him like looking down and grimacing when she would say something and kind of like laughing, and he knew he was being filmed, and it just seemed to me that the social media sentiment kind of creeped into the courtroom. I don't know for a fact, but it just seemed that way, and maybe that's what's going on with this one here is that there's tidbits of information and folks are now jumping in,
right?
And so you're being tried in public big time, on a family law case.
I know.
Yeah, so.
I think what's interesting is in the Johnny Depp case, that social media seemed to really help him, and in this case,
it's hurting.
It's
maybe.
hurting Joe.
Yeah, and it could hurt a career too, I guess. If the public believes that you're just this nasty person because of how you behave in family court or in your divorce, that might go against the goodwill you have or the likability if that's important to your stardom, right?
Well, and this is actually a good place to talk about how this may be applicable to our viewers and potential clients. Of course, very few people are going to be dealing with their divorce on such a grand, scale. However, we do tell our clients to be careful what you say, especially around the children. If you're going around town bad-mouthing the mother or the father of your children, there's the potential that that's going to make you look poorly in court because the judge wants, wants to remind you both are parents to this child. Being a good parent to that child also means being a good co-parent, and that can look different in different situations, but it never looks like bad-mouthing, around town.
Yeah, let's talk about some of those scenarios. Let's say that there's a social media site belonging to one of your kids' schools, and the parents talk on there and stuff, and suddenly some comments are being made, right? Or just getting on a Facebook page and saying a bunch of nasty things. There's a freedom of speech, obviously. You can't, in most cases, stop somebody from posting, about those things. But, I think that you're right, is it could have a backlash in court and even out in the public with all the friends and family and stuff.
Right.
So that practice is funny. But, we're talking about trying the case in public. Just the other day, I was telling somebody that I've had so many clients say, and come after me, we should write a book about, my experiences in divorce, as if their case was newsworthy or even remotely interesting to the public at large, because what they don't know is how severe that was on their emotions, their pocketbook, and a change in their life. There's millions of people that go through that all the time.
It's unfortunately not unique.
Yeah, it's not that unique and
right.
stuff, but when you're in it, you feel like it is. And I think that a lot of these celebrities, and one name will go on without mention. You might be running for office right now, but when they're a public figure and they're a celebrity, they think that celebrity status could give them a license to say whatever they want, and basically everybody's gonna, because you love me, right?
Right. I think, not to harp on Joe too much, it does seem like a miscalculated PR campaign. But so moving on from that, again, there's some silence between September 9th and September 21st. On September 21st, Sophie files in New York, and she is asking that the children be returned to England pursuant to the Hague Convention.
Is that where she's from, by the way?
Yes.
Okay.
So she grew up in England, and as you'll see, we'll get into it. Her filing, I thought, was really interesting. I was actually able to get the entire filing and read it.
Interesting.
And I thought it was very well done. And as we get further into it, I can tell you why. But I want.
Is he from Florida?
He's
an American.
American.
Obviously.
He was born in Arizona. You'll see in a second.
Okay.
In her filing, some interesting facts came about. She states that the habitual residence of the children is in England, and habitual residence is something I'm going to spend a lot of time on, so we'll come back to that. She calls him a very successful and popular musician while calling herself an actor, and I'm almost wondering if she's kind of sowing the seeds for a support order. I don't obviously know how support works in England, but I just thought it was an interesting way of characterizing him. And then she gives the ages of when they first started dating, which really isn't relevant. But But I think it's a little bit of that PR play, because once there started to be this backlash against Jo, something that was talked about a lot was how young she was when they started dating. She was 20 and he was 27. And so people, they had a child very soon after. So that was definitely something that was being talked about. And I wonder if that's why they...
Maybe in England that matters. Out here in California, unless you're about 60 and you're dating a 19-year-old, eyebrows don't even raise anymore.
Maybe they wouldn't have if he hadn't done, his PR campaign. But people were looking for anything to kind of fight back with him. And they chose that, which is interesting. She said that they moved frequently until April 2023, when they made England their permanent home.
With kids?
With the kids.
Ooh.
Up until that point, they had not committed to setting down roots in any particular place. That's a direct quote. And then she said something else like, with their careers, they didn't have to find a permanent place. They were still moving around. The children were young.
Actors have to move around a lot.
Exactly. And then around Christmas 2022, they decided to look for a home in England for their forever home. So it's
what date was that?
That was December 2022. Okay. And so what you might be thinking is that contradicting the April 2023 date that she gave as England becoming the children's habitual residence?
Well, I wouldn't contradict that. A viewer might. So why don't I explain? You'll explain that.
Yes. So I think what happened was, they decide in Christmas 2022 that they're going to start looking in England. But then in April...
when England became the home state.
The habitual residence.
Yeah. And is there a 6-month requirement?
I actually don't know in England. I'm not sure. The Hague didn't give a timing, but we're going to get further into that because there's actually a very interesting Supreme Court.
Let me say something here. Even if England doesn't, if you're in a state that recognizes UGEA, you would argue that this state does not have jurisdiction because of the fact that England became the home state under UGEA, and we know that because the children were there in December, and fast forward all the way to April there, and it seems like that's 5 months rather than 6, but be that as it may, that's when it acquired jurisdiction.
Well, and so what I should mention is she's not saying that they stayed in England from Christmas 2022 through April. She's not basing it off of that. She's basing it off of they decided to look for their home in England. They exchanged contracts to buy a home in England, and that's in July. And they also had previously bought a home in Miami. They bought that in 2021, but then put it on the market April 2023. And so I think that's where that April 2023 date is coming from. They sold their property, and that's when they were really making the steps to make England their permanent home. I think is what I'm saying. But they kind of attack it from a couple different ways. She also then, which I thought was really good, lists where the children have lived since September 3rd, 2022. I didn't copy it, but no date is unaccounted for.
So it's kind of a vacuum jurisdiction type of thing. You got to have it someplace.
Somewhere has to be able to rule. And it shows that they were only in Miami, at that Miami property they owned, on 3 occasions for a total of 11 weeks, which flies in the face of Jo's assertion that they met that requirement to file in Florida. They shipped a lot of the children's belongings to England in March 2023. They put everything else in storage. And she says that they officially relocated to England in April 2023. They didn't have the home, but they were renting, and that's where they were going to stay.
So it might be also forum nonconvenience type of an argument. We've had that before where, you kind of slip back to, look, even if there's a technical reason why you might choose this as the home state, you could go on, that'd be completely inconvenient for everybody because the children are over here, their school records are here, and things of that nature and stuff. But I would think that if there's complete vacuum, that the kids haven't been anywhere, they've been like moving around, you got to have some place, and that's a good argument as to why to put it there, I guess, right?
And then on that same line of thinking, the children are dual citizens with England and the U.S. They receive their routine medical care and dental care in England. They have friends. They do their extracurriculars. And the oldest child attended nursery school full-time in England. And, of course, I meant to mention this when we first started. This is her argument. We don't know that these are facts, and I don't have Jo's response. So this is just what she's saying. I'm not saying it is true or not.
His response is, let's go to mediation and Let's not talk about this anymore.
Don, this is why you are the managing partner. We get there pretty soon. So she starts filming in England. She starts filming a show. This is her first significant project since having the children. And then he was with her until July 31st. He leaves then with the children. The parties decided that because she was going to be filming during the day, whereas his concerts were at night, it'd be better for the children to be with him and a nanny. For the month of August, she was scheduled to come back to the United States in September 2023. It was only temporary that the children were going to be with Joe, and they had an agreement that she would come back on September 14th, stay for a week, and return home with the children on the 20th.
So she's saying that he was inappropriately holding on to the kids.
That's exactly what she's saying. She also says, and this is pretty interesting to me, they had an argument on August 15th, and then he filed on September 1st. It's like she's saying they had this one argument and everything was done. It just finished and he filed. The other thing she says, which isn't necessarily legally relevant, but definitely doesn't paint him in the best light, is that she didn't find out that he had filed until September 5th, the same time that the general public found out, and she found out through the media.
Mm-hmm. It's like learning that you got fired from a job, through the reading from the press. Yeah.
And she says that he incorrectly said that the children have resided in Florida for 6 months. They then met on September 17th, so during that period of time where it was kind of quiet, to discuss the separation. And she was still planning on returning home to England with the children per their agreement on September 20th. He has the passports, wouldn't give them to her, and would not consent to let them go back to England. On September 19th, his attorney confirmed this, and then they filed on the 21st. So the biggest thing I'm seeing is that there are two different stories regarding residence, and we know how important that is. So she says they're residents of England, and he says they're residents of Florida. Almost immediately after she files, we get a statement from Joe's rep, basically everything that you would assume he'd say, that she knew the divorce was coming, that Florida was the appropriate jurisdiction, and that the Florida court had already entered an order that restricts both parents from relocating with the children. And I almost think that line that the Florida court had entered an order is supposed to try to make people think, it's out of Joe's hands. He has no control. The court said the kids can't leave Florida. And we know that, yes, that is the order made, but the parties can come to an agreement and consent for changes to that.
It almost sounds like they were in a court of law and the judge pointed his or her finger at her and said, okay, you got this, you're ordered. What probably happened is he filed his summons and petition in Florida, and there's some temporary restraining orders that are attached, and of course it's signed by the judge who's never looked at it before. It's stamped.
It's not based on any of the merits. The same thing happens in California. Yeah. And then, lucky for them, lucky-ish, on September 25th, they sign an interim consent order to keep the children in New York. So everyone is in agreement on that.
That's a little different there. So he's presumably in Florida?
He's now in New York.
Oh, he's now in New York. Okay.
I mean, he's still on tour, so I don't really know where he is. But
and she's in New York temporarily as well, right now?
She's in New York temporarily. Okay. So they decide to do that. They're both have been seen in New York with the children. She's been seen with Taylor Swift, who I know you know Taylor. I don't know if you know that Taylor dated Joe Jonas, and it was, a big thing many years ago, but people are...
I did not know that.
Definitely eating up the pictures of Sophie and Taylor. And on October 3rd, so that's next week, there's a pre-trial conference in New York, so we may have some new news for people.
That's the Hague Convention stuff.
Yes.
So I wonder if there's an order that they can't leave New York, the state of New York now.
I think that's what they signed. They signed the order.
Yeah. Okay.
And so we already talked about the two things I want to talk about is, one, public perception and how that applies to our viewers who may not be giant celebrities. But the more legal thing I want to talk about is this Hague Convention and what it means and what it does. And there's actually a very interesting newer case that talks about from the Supreme Court that deals with the definition of the habitual residence for an infant. And the reason our courts have to do that is because the Hague Convention never actually gives a definition for what that means. And I read that it's because no one could come up with agreeable phrasing. And I should mention that Family Lawyer magazine was very helpful in this section. So the case I wanted to talk about was Mononsky v. Taglieri. I hope I'm saying that correctly. And it is directly it's directly asking the court to define habitual residence. And wouldn't you know, we get not a great answer. We don't get a bright line rule or a rule really at all that we would like. But it's still very interesting. So before this decision, there had been 3 standards used in different circuits. Of course, the habitual residence definition is important, and it goes to the heart of the Hague, one of the hearts of the Hague Convention, which is to prevent forum shopping. It makes it much more difficult. Many countries have signed on to the Hague Convention. The U.S. and England both signed in the same year, which was 1988, which I thought was interesting. But so in the U.S., because there had been no definition, the circuits had come up with different standards. There is the acclimatization standard, which is focused on where the child has physically been present for an amount of time sufficient for acclimatization, and which has a degree of settled purpose from the child's perspective.
Good God.
So it looks at the child's connectivity to a place through objective criteria such as school, extracurricular activities, social activities, and meaningful relationships with people in that place. It's a difficult standard.
Very difficult. Could you imagine trying to argue that in court, or how easy it would be for the court to enunciate? I mean, you could just make that argument for both sides a lot of times. So.
Well, and if you remember from Sophie's filing, she talked about how the oldest child went to school in England. They got their dentistry done. It's hitting these
bells and whistles.
Exactly. Then there's the shared parental intent standard, where the parties intended for the child to be raised, which again opens up a whole can of worms. It's a he said, she said. When you are deciding with your partner where you're going to live, you don't sign a contract saying that. And then there's the hybrid of both standards. So by the time that this case comes to be decided, there's no decision as to what the definition of the habitual residence is. In this case, they meet and they marry in Illinois. Then they relocate to Italy. There's no definite agreement that this is where they're going to live long term. She becomes pregnant, but the marriage is over before the child is born. She has an emergency C-section and cannot leave Italy due to that, and also because the child doesn't have a passport. He then says they reconcile, but she told him that she intended to return to the U.S. with the child as soon as possible. When the child is 6 weeks old, I actually don't know the gender of the child, but when the child is 6 weeks old, mother and child are placed in a DV shelter. At 8 weeks, they leave Italy and return to the U.S. And then, there's the filings that are necessary. Yeah. The district court finds that Italy was the habitual residence. And it brought up some interesting questions, because how do you show the acclimatization of a 6-week-old child? It's a question without a real answer. And Family Lawyer magazine nicely put it, there's an open question which this case needed to answer. So the Supreme Court rules a child's habitual residence depends on the totality of the circumstances specific to the case, providing one uniform legal standard for this key term for the first time, applicable to all children. It's not really a standard that they're giving us.
Right.
And it was a unanimous decision for Dad. Italy was the habitual residence. And I thought it was so interesting. The child is 6 weeks old, it's 8 weeks old. You're saying that that's the habitual residence. It seems like an interesting decision, but I also don't know how you would make this decision. There's not a lot to go on.
Yeah, and I don't think you could ever get all the countries to agree as to what the habitual residence is. I think the Hague serves other purposes besides that, by the way. It's where there's a order in place, mm-hmm. and somebody's withholding, and there's a mechanism for getting the child back is the important part of Hague, one of the many important parts. But yeah, even within the United States, we have the UGIA, but there is some differences in UGIA interpretation among the states. For California's purpose, they're not something that I worry about, and stuff, but there and stuff. But the biggest one here is the child, where the child has lived for the past 6 months, and or where the child was born. There's one case where the child was less than 6 months old, and the court had to determine whether it was Hawaii or California, and they determined it was Hawaii because that's where the child was born. And the father goes into court right away. I think the child was like 4 or 5 months old and says, "Aha, she's over here right now." So you know what I mean. So yeah.
It's difficult, very difficult. The court also said that an actual agreement is not required, which Mom was arguing. She was arguing that for it to be Italy, there had to be an actual agreement. But that argument doesn't really work because the flip side could be true. For it to be Illinois, there had to be an actual agreement. And there didn't seem like there was an actual agreement either way.
Yeah.
So I see why that was not as persuasive. The court also said the following, which I thought was, it's a good summary, but it is going to be difficult in practice. A child habitually resides where she is at home. No single fact is dispositive of all cases. Instead, courts must make fact-driven inquiry sensitive to the unique circumstances of the case and informed by common sense. And so knowing all of this, I initially thought it was a great filing, but I think it's an even better filing on Sophie's part because they seem to have hit every and all factor that you could. They had an agreement that they were going to move back. They had purchased the forever home. The children were going to school, had friends. She's hitting all the different points. So no matter which way you slice it, no matter which court is looking at it, it's almost like there's something there for everyone.
Yeah. Plus, you're building your case knowing that the court has wide discretion, so you might start arguing as hard as you can about every little fact that would persuade a judge, right? So cool.
It's very interesting to me. I hope it was informative, and we're going to have, I think we'll have more information on October 3rd, so we might have to sit back down and dissect what happens.
That sounds good. Well, let's stand by for that. That was really good. So thank you, Brooke, for joining us, and thank you for joining us on Celebrity Stories, and we'll see you next time.